Your manager corrects you in front of the team, then smiles and says, "Just keeping everyone aligned." A colleague talks over you in meetings, and the one time you push back, someone pulls you aside afterward to say, "You seemed a little aggressive today." You get left out of a decision, and when you notice, you're told it was informal, spontaneous, nothing to read into. You receive feedback that your communication needs work, but no one can point to a single sentence, a single moment, anything concrete. Your work gets scrutinized at a level no one else's does, and errors that would pass without comment if someone else made them become, in your case, patterns worth documenting. Every time you try to locate the specific thing that is wrong, you find yourself, not the situation. Here's what you need to understand before anything else. Your uncertainty about whether any of this is actually happening, that uncertainty is not a failure of your perception. It is evidence that the system is functioning exactly as intended. You are not dealing with a miscommunication. You are not dealing with a difficult personality or a clash of working styles. You are inside a pattern that was specifically structured to survive your ability to name it. The reason you have not been able to name it is not because you were wrong about what you sensed. It is because you were handed the wrong explanation for what you were sensing. You were told it was a conflict, a misunderstanding, a matter of fit. It is none of those things. Now look at what this has already done to you. You check your messages more than you should, not because something is pending, but because you are trying to read the temperature of the room before you walk into it. You rehearse conversations in advance. You over-explain decisions you used to make without a second thought. You have apologized for things that did not require an apology, and after the apology, you cannot entirely explain why you gave it. You dissect your own emails before sending them. You leave meetings and immediately replay what you said, searching for what might be used against you later. Meetings produce anxiety before they start. You used to have opinions you delivered without calculating what it would cost you first. That version of yourself has gotten quieter and quieter. You have probably told yourself that it's professional maturity, or growth, or learning to pick your battles. It is none of those things. That contraction, that careful, hyper-monitored, preemptive version of yourself you have become, is what sustained exposure to an unpredictable social environment does to a person's behavior. Your nervous system adapted to a situation where the rules were enforced inconsistently and where the consequences fell only on you. That adaptation is not weakness. Your nervous system read the environment correctly. The environment is the problem. Now look at what that environment is actually constructed from. Think about a meeting where you raised something legitimate and the response was not about what you raised. It was about how you raised it. You were too blunt, too forceful, too much of something that no one could precisely define. The substance of your concern disappeared entirely. Now you were defending your manner instead of being heard, and the original issue went unaddressed while you explained yourself. What happened in that exchange is a technique. The focus was shifted deliberately from the content to the delivery, which neutralized your point while simultaneously repositioning you as someone who communicates poorly. 2 outcomes in 90 seconds. No record of either. Think about the moments where you met a standard and the standard moved, where you completed something carefully and the criteria shifted before the approval came, where there was no version of your performance that resulted in consistent acknowledgement, and you kept working harder trying to find the version that would satisfy the bar. That increased effort is not coincidental. The bar is not meant to be reached. It is calibrated to stay just ahead of you, close enough to pursue, far enough to keep your attention on your own performance rather than on the pattern underneath it. Think about being corrected in front of other people. Think about how that feels different from being corrected in private. It is different not because the content of the correction changed, but because public correction sends a social signal that is entirely independent of whatever the correction was about. It establishes hierarchy in the room. It tells every person watching where you rank relative to the person speaking. The bully rarely needs to do this more than a few times. After that, the positioning holds on its own without further effort. And think about your reputation inside this organization, not what you have done, but how you are discussed. You may have already sensed that some people carry a version of you that you did not create, that your contributions get absorbed and your mistakes get circulated. By the time you walk into a room, the perception of you has already been shaped, because controlling how people see you is more efficient than controlling what you do. None of this requires a calculated, self-aware villain. that image actually makes the pattern harder to recognize. What you are inside is a system for protecting social hierarchy. The person doing this to you is responding to a perceived threat, to their status, their authority, their control over how they are perceived in this organization. The behavior is protection of existing rank. It follows social logic rather than emotional dysfunction, which means it is consistent, repeatable, and highly effective. And here is the specific part that explains why nobody around you seems to see it. It operates precisely inside the boundary of what can be proven. The damage lands in tone, not in text. The exclusion is framed as coincidence. The reputation circulates informally before anything reaches a document. Each individual action has an explanation available. It is only the pattern that reveals the function, and patterns are not accepted as evidence in formal processes. This is why your coworkers say nothing. They see more than they are acknowledging. They notice who gets credited and who gets absorbed. They notice whose ideas get taken seriously and whose get the small, practiced skepticism before the room has even heard them out. They have registered the pattern. Most of them stay quiet. Not primarily because they are unkind people, but because intervening means choosing a side in an organization where the bully is either higher status than you or protected by people who are. Silence costs nothing. Speaking up costs something specific and career adjacent. The calculation is not complicated, and the result, regardless of anyone's intentions, is that your behavior continues to be watched while theirs continues without friction. Your isolation deepens, and the group's collective silence functions as social consensus. Nobody endorsed what was happening. Nobody had to. The absence of opposition was sufficient. Meanwhile, the formal documentation of your performance has likely already begun in ways you don't fully know about. When the bully has access to your manager or is your manager, the record of your issues often predates your awareness that issues have been identified. The categories are always recognizable: communication concerns, resistance to feedback, questions about your fit within the team culture. These are precisely the fields where informal reputation damage becomes institutional fact. And institutional documentation carries weight that your personal account of your experience almost never matches, especially when what you experienced was an environment rather than a series of discrete incidents. HR processes are built to investigate events. What happened to you is not an event. That mismatch is not a design flaw in HR. It is the precise point where the system is most protected from your account of it. What typically follows? A mediation that treats a structural power imbalance as a communication problem between equivalent parties, or a formal finding that the evidence was insufficient to support your account, and you leave carrying a new designation, the person who filed a complaint, while those you named continue with the additional institutional credibility of having been reviewed and cleared. You came forward to be protected. You left more exposed than when you entered. Here is the clearest frame for understanding what you were actually inside. You were not in a conflict. Conflict implies two parties with comparable standing, operating on roughly equal terms where both sides carry real risk. What you were inside is a pattern with a function, a pattern with infrastructure, bystanders who sustain it through silence, management processes that formalize it through documentation, and an institutional response system built to manage organizational liability rather than your experience within the organization. Every component of that system worked as designed, including the part where you couldn't name it, including the part where you began wondering if the problem was something you were doing wrong, including the part where you worked harder, apologized more, made yourself smaller, and became that quieter and more careful version of yourself, because the pattern required your confusion in order to keep running. A person who clearly understands what is being done to them is a direct threat to that pattern's continued operation. You were not failing in that environment. You were accurately perceiving a system that was specifically designed to make you doubt your own accuracy. The self-doubt was not a personal failing. It was the intended output. That is exactly where the pattern needed you to stay. It needed you confused. It needed you self-correcting. It needed you focused on yourself.